It's been an interesting morning this morning. I had some trouble sleeping last night. I've been pretty deeply afraid of the ways I've been changing and what they might mean for the practicality of my life or what other people might think of me as I venture into sharing more who I am. And alongside my fear, I felt some sadness about that, about things I might lose, like people's approval, depending on choices I make. And I felt some compassion for myself. We're always changing, and we're always losing things as a result of our changes. And at this point in my life, having seen this enough times, I don't really believe it's something we can control anymore. I don't really believe we're able to choose who we are, which is to say, what we're drawn to and what we're capable of. And those realities dictate the course of our lives in ways that determine whose approval we get or don't get, or where we're successful or where we fail. I don't think we can choose who we are, and so I think a lot of other things are determined by that given reality. So I was thinking about that. Today I wanted to do really an experiment for me, which is to spend some time filming myself on camera talking about spiritual principles or realities that seem very dear to me. This is something I tried doing a few nights ago by phone with a couple cherished friends, but I haven't tried filming myself doing it before, and it feels like a challenge that I want to take. I know that I want to share this part of myself, and this is a popular way of doing it, and it's not something I've tried before. I've not tried really sharing this part of myself publicly in many ways, but I'm starting to venture into doing that, and this is another way. So I'm going to be talking about some spiritual realizations that came to me a little over a week ago. Initially, I talked these out to myself. I was just sitting on my bed and I was like gonna read, and then I didn't really want to read, and so I just listened into that and I started talking aloud instead. And some of what I'll share today initially came out then, and I mean, you'll hear, given my beliefs about the nature of the universe, I don't really think it matters that I'm sharing with you versus sharing alone. But I know that I get pleasure from being in conversation with other people, and so I think that's why I'm doing this more than anything. I believe that the universe is energy, and so even sharing alone matters absolutely. The first thing that came to me when I was sitting there that other night, and it's the idea with which I want to begin this transmission, is that the fundamental nature of the universe is peace and love. It's a single vibration that has that tenor. This is something each of us can feel into in our own experience, regardless of whether we've undertaken spiritual vehicles like meditation or going to church or yoga or things like that. The knowledge will be there for every human being, no matter what. To see this, I ask you to inquire into the way you felt as a young child. I would say when you were a baby, but that's not really something most of us have conscious access to anymore. There are some people like Salvador Dali who claim to remember their infancy, but I don't know, perhaps it's true. Generally, I take that as posturing. He had a very avant-garde persona that he was trying to maintain. But anyhow, if we feel into and remember into how we were as young children, we'll see that our identity was not fixed. That is, we didn't really have a centralized self yet. Remembering how we were on the playground, we'll know that we seamlessly shifted from our identity into other identities and back. So if I were playing, house, for instance, I was the father in the house, even though I, as Jackson, was only, 4 years old, 3 years old. I became a man in his late 20s or 30s or 40s or whatever. My imagination made the transition seamless, and then I came back to myself as Jackson when it was time to leave the playground, and there was no sense that anything out of the ordinary had happened. Neither was there a sense of shame about it. This was just something I could do unself-consciously as a child. And it's something we can all do as children, and something that we do naturally. We seamlessly transition identities. The reason that's important is that it allows sensation to flow into and out of us in a way that brings peace and that instills us with love. I mentioned meditation at the beginning. Anyone who has meditated, and even if you've just read about it, you know that a central part of the experience is that rather than identifying with your thoughts or feelings, you witness them as they pass. That is, you identify with the space and time that circumscribe the thoughts and feelings. And so, rather than be attached to them and make them synonymous with your identity, you become able to watch them go. And this can lead to ease of being. In the same way, as children, we were identified more with ephemerality or that passing quality, that flow, than we were with what eventually became the singular identity. This is important because even when the self receives pain, that need not be its lasting reality. As a child, you may have fallen on the playground and hurt your knee or your hand or whatever, and you may have cried about it. And then say your parent came and comforted you and you got a Band-Aid for your boo-boo, and then it healed and you forgot about it and the pain went away. That's that kind of seamless experience, too, of the coming and going that is synonymous with peace and love. It's sort of a dispassionate quality. If you've been in a truly stable and committed, and I would say transfiguring relationship, an element of this kind of relationship is that rather than judge and try to change the partner, you simply watch them evolve. And that's this same kind of invested but simultaneously detached observation. It's this identification with space that is peace and love that I'm talking about. We watch our partner grow with glee, with bliss. We are excited to see how they evolve, but we are not trying to manage that involvement. Another metaphor is, say, tending to a flower, curating a garden. You facilitate the flower's evolution, but you don't manage it. So all of this was available to us as children. And if you go back even further, I don't feel the need to dwell on this too much longer, but if you go to the state of consciousness of a baby, it's even more redolent, even more blatant. The baby is immersed in whatever it's experiencing. When a familiar face comes in front of the baby, there's this overwhelming joy. The baby is like ecstatic to be linked with this other consciousness. And when the baby is distressed or hungry or tired, it cries, and then that sadness passes, and there's no identification with it. There's no self yet. The baby, like the young child, is synonymous with flow, is an open circuit for experience. So this is the first teaching, that peace and love are the fundamental vibration or condition of the universe. This openness, this dispassionate observation or watching, this non-identification. And not only are we born from that and into it, when we die we will return to it. And our entire life is bounded within it. Everything that we experience, all the turbulence, all the anxiety I was experiencing last night, the fear and the sadness, despair we may have, anger, feelings of resentment, feelings of stuckness or boredom, all of these contrasting and illuminated experiences that seem to have some hardness and some salience to us, underneath them all is this unchanging vibration of peace and love. We knew it when we were young, and even when we cease to know it, when we forget later in our lives, it's still there. I'll explain a bit later on why that's important, that we cannot reduce it. There's no way to take it away, no matter what we might do, no matter how we try. So that reality having been presented, this fundamental condition of peace and love that we knew when young, the question then presents itself, what happens? Because this sense of seamlessness and ability to flow among identities is not something most adults would claim. In fact, one reason I might experience fear about sharing a video like this is that even talking about those things can brand us as cuckoo, right? Transitioning among identities, that form of porousness, is associated with schizophrenia. It has a DSM diagnosis. So, not only do we lose the capacity, we're afraid to regain it and to claim it. Water's good, so drinking it. The question of what happens is really the question of how does the self get formed? And there are a few associated questions. If we're asking how does the self get formed, then another question is what is the self? Another question might be what precedes the self, but I've already spoken about that. It's this absolute condition of peace and love that, for me, is what I am thinking of when I describe God. It's the totality of the universe. It's irremovable, irreducible, inarguable. So I've spoken about pain and how pain passes through us when we're young. When I first started thinking about this, I thought that pain was what created the self. When I burn my hand, say, or in the earlier example I used, hurt it in some way on a playground, then and only then do I become aware of my hand in a way that most of the time I'm not. Most of the time proceeding through my reality, I'm relatively ignorant of my body. In other words, my body only transmits signals to me when there's a problem. Pleasurable sensations too, but we're more keen to notice the problematic ones, the painful ones. So when I first started thinking about this, I thought that pain was what introduced the experience of self. I burn my hand and suddenly this is my body, this is my hand, and it hurts. And in that moment, I'm no longer undifferentiated with the totality of consciousness, but rather localized here as Jackson, the one with the burnt hand. But it's not really that creates a self. Because, as I was saying earlier, especially when we're young and porous, when we're relatively pure, pain, like other sensations, passes through us. So, this is the second of my essential principles that I want to communicate. Trauma is what creates the self, not pain, but trauma. And trauma is pain plus a message. As simple as that. It's pain plus the message that due to some identity characteristic, we deserve that pain. That pain is our lot. And this is what makes the pain stick, makes us hold onto it as part of our identity. So selfhood is necessarily narrative-based. It's pain plus the message that I deserve that pain, which creates a narrative around either maintaining or rejecting the pain. So this is abstract, so I'll give some examples. I'll go back to the playground metaphor because I think a lot of this starts to happen when we're young. You know, childhood is this really fertile phase where we are at once playing and engaging in this open manner with the world that I've been speaking about, and simultaneously being damaged through schooling experiences, through our society at large, through parenting, through friendships that fall away, other members of our family. We're being damaged in ways that are beginning to inculcate the story of self, the traumatic foundation of self. One way this might happen, let's say we become racialized as a black person or another person of color. W.E.B. Du Bois spoke of the moment when he became black. This is an experience I think many children of color have. In fact, I remember being with a friend of color on a childhood playground and looking at our hands and comparing how the fronts, the palms, were almost the same color and the backs were a different color. Hers were significantly darker than mine. In moments like that, a self is born and the person becomes black. And the message is being communicated that the pain of alienation or perceived inferiority that the person experiences in this white dominant society is a pain that they deserve because they're black. In other words, the pain is being locked in as an irremovable part of the identity. So often it's social exclusion. It's that social judgment accompanying the gut level pain of not belonging or feeling like we don't belong that brings on this narrative of self. I am black and being black is wrong or inferior. Here we have a self, this traumatic notion swimming in a narrative, bound up in a narrative. Another example I think of is many women who I think at young ages are taught that their bodies do not belong to them. Either symbolic or physical objectification takes place and the message is delivered. your your own body and time are not your property, and that's because you are a woman. You do not deserve to be free, and that's because you are a woman. Here we have, again, trauma, as I'm defining it, and with it, a notion of self. So it's not just the pain of having what is rightfully mine taken away from me, but it's the meta level of the message delivered on top of that that says, and you deserve this pain because of your identity. And in that message, the identity is born and it sticks. Some messages like this I received when young, and really it continued throughout my adolescence and later. We can continue to be saddled with traumatizing messages like this throughout our whole lives. Some of mine were, I am too weak, I am too short, I am too thin, I'm too smart, I'm too creative, I'm too weird, too Jewish, I have too little money when that was an issue for part of my family, and then I have too much later on, and this became a problem for me. So really anything that can make us feel excluded, or that there's something wrong with us, and in that way the pain becomes encased in a narrative of self. So that's the difference between pain and trauma, and how trauma, when it sticks, when we believe it, encodes this narrative of self. Now, I have a faux stained glass window here, and it can be really beautiful when the sun shines through it, so I took a glance. It's also beginning to get brighter for me, so I'm like not as able to tell whether I'm looking into the eye of the camera, but probably it's a better image for you. What I'm about to describe is what most selves are engaged in for the majority of their lives, which I think of as the project of selfhood. So originally we were undifferentiated as consciousness. That is to say, we had what Adam and Eve had in the parable of the Garden of Eden. We were one with existence. This is the state into which we're born, and as I said earlier, it will be there all throughout our lives, and when we die, we will return to it. It's that's an unavoidable reality. Then the self was created through trauma, which individualized us. It created an identity that was synonymous with a sense of wrongness. I am Jackson, and there is something wrong with me. And I listed a number of these perceived sources of wrongness for myself. What the self then begins to do, what it becomes concerned with, is disproving these foundational narratives of wrongness. And it does that through external achievement. This is what, in modern spiritual parlance, we call the ego. So, Eckhart Tolle speaks of the ego as an insane entity. It always wants more, it always wants something different, it's never satisfied. This is the project of selfhood. So, if I perceive myself as weak, for instance, I'm always going to feel the need to build up my body through bodybuilding or through targeted kinds of eating. I'm always going to need to assert myself socially in order to prove myself as a dominant person, and these examples are associated with masculinity for me. And it's never going to be enough. There's always going to be another challenge. And so the self is at war with itself. And as I said earlier, this is what most selves are engaged in for the entirety of their lives. We are trying to improve ourselves while at the same time, deep down and necessarily, constantly reinforcing and testifying to the belief that there's something wrong with us, this belief that has been encoded in us through the foundational trauma. This leads to a quiet inner struggle that is lifelong. The image that comes to me is one of attrition. It is the self picking at itself throughout its life, chipping away. Something wrong with me, I have to expose it. Have to solve the problem at core of me. I mentioned Eckhart Tolle a moment ago. A way I can be dissatisfied with popular spiritual discourses around this is that they seek to solve this problem of selfhood by writing off a natural or understandable element of the self, which is the ego. This drive to improve ourselves, to change things. If you think about the dynamic in the way I've laid it out, it's getting so bright now, I don't know if I can do this. I may have to wear glasses to finish. My eyes will adjust in a moment, though. If you think about this dynamic in the way I've laid it out, it makes perfect sense that the self would want to improve itself, to correct itself in this way. What we really want through these self-improvement projects, what we're really striving for, is this foundational vibration of peace and love that, as children, we had, and a part of us still remembers. I believe I said this earlier. This is why what the project of selfhood really is the attempt to disprove the foundational traumatic narrative. If I can only disprove that I'm weak, if I can only disprove that I have too much money or too little, if I can only disprove that my intellect is a problem. And I've already gone through other examples of how this could manifest. It's through race, class, gender, anything that can make us believe there's something wrong with us. If I can only disprove this notion, then the love that I once had as my birthright in this universe will come flooding back to me. It's important for me to hold out compassion for that part of the self, that desire within the self, that project, which we think of as ego, because it's a natural response to the trauma that created us as an individual self to begin with. I don't think it's foolish to attempt to write off or transcend the ego. However, I think it denotes a lack of compassion for oneself, or perhaps an incomplete understanding. Of course, a traumatized self would respond in that way. And we do, and I do. I mean, even in this moment, I am challenging myself to do something, in part because that's what a self is. A self issues challenges for itself so that it can prove itself good, seeking to restore that love that it once had and lost. So, I've said that this project of seeking to improve the self is something that most selves are engaged in for the entire lifespan. And it is. But some selves become aware of it through crisis points. And what a crisis point is a moment when the fundamentally self-destructive orientation of the self is exposed. This can happen in minor ways such as self-sabotage. Or really, self-sabotage is our superficial way of the dynamic that is exposing itself more deeply. The core structure of the self coming to light. That's what it is. That's what self-sabotage really indicates. So, for instance, I have a job that I've been seeking for years, and suddenly I quit the job. Or I begin, this is if I'm less conscious of it, I begin acting within the job in ways that will prompt for me to be fired. That's self-sabotage. Or, I was just making sure it was still being recorded, thank God. Or say I'm in a marriage, and a fundamental project of my life has been, I must get married, I must be a good husband, wife, partner, if we're looking outside traditional gender binaries. This is one that's relevant for me. A part of my story of self is that I don't know how to have committed relationships. And so there has been a quality pushing, challenging, to try to prove this untrue of myself in order that I may once again have peace and love. So we may sabotage a relationship that we've worked very hard to form. We may throw away money or possessions of a sudden. Those are minor forms of self-sabotage. There are more destructive ones. We might commit violence to someone outside ourselves. Or we might self-harm, or in the extreme, we might even extinguish ourselves. That, to me, is the consequence of this fundamentally self-destructive or self-loathing nature of the self having been maximally suppressed for a lifetime. Then, when it emerges, the intensity will be so great that we may, in fact, extinguish ourselves through suicide. But at any rate, there will be this moment where it's exposed that underlying our every moment's attempt to improve ourselves in some way, to demonstrate ourselves worthy of the love and peace that we have lost, is this secret belief that there's something very, very wrong with us. This moment of exposing this secret belief is extremely important because it opens up the possibility of spiritual realization. Once we see that the attempt to improve the self relies on the belief that there's something wrong with the self, we understand that the two are intertwined, and therefore that the project of self is doomed. Another way of putting this is, as an individual self, as a consciousness that was traumatized away from my state of oneness and into a narrower and narrower identity, sort of tunneling inward. As this individuality, I do not know how to live. And not only do I not know, I cannot know. It is knowledge denied me by the structure of my selfhood. I say this is the moment of, or at least a possible moment of spiritual initiation, because necessarily then we will look outside the self for help. For me, the first resource was human help. And I think that's natural. I think that's where most selves will go. The reason is, as our consciousness becomes narrowed away from the oneness through a life of frequently incurred and then aggregating trauma, collecting, growing trauma, we start to doubt anything but the self. As we become more and more individualized, the only thing we trust is ourselves. This then is why it's a crisis when the self-sabotage emerges, because we realize, I don't know how to live, and I am the only thing I've trusted. So what am I going to do? It's natural to trust another human self because they look like us. They look more like us than a tree or a spirit or a deity that we have in the form of an idol, something that would be far outside our realm of the normal, the realm that's been established through our trauma and its perpetuation. And so human help usually comes first. I want to acknowledge something here, which is that not everyone receives human help in this moment of crisis. And in fact, I think most people do not. I think most selves do not. We live in a very brutal world, in a very unequal world, in terms of how love is distributed to people. After my crisis of selfhood, I received a lot of love from many sources, and it changed me, and it's responsible for everything that came afterward. But I know that there are many more people who do not receive support in that moment. This is where a political orientation becomes relevant. I think any true politics will be concerned with allotting love to people who have not received it. It will on some level be aware that the individual project of selfhood is doomed, and therefore that we need external love in order to not only survive but thrive within life. Furthermore, an authentic or true politics will know that love is unequally and unjustly distributed in our world at this time. This again intersects with things like race and class. I know that as a white person in a society where I see faces that look like mine in media all of the time, it is easier to believe myself normal even as I go through challenging and potentially breaking experiences than it would be were that not the case. I see examples of myself having gone through hardship and made it. And those examples communicate support to me subliminally, even if no one in my immediate sphere is able to provide that support. So that's just one example of the ways in which this necessary resource of love is not equally available throughout our reality. Another example, or really kind of an out picture I want to give to bring this point home, is, you see a schizophrenic on the street, a schizophrenic homeless person, someone talking to themselves. I mean, point A, I'm talking to myself right now. It's going to be accepted, my doing this, because I have a community that loves me, and I'm educated in such a way that I'm able to articulate this awareness so that people can receive it. I'm able to translate it to a commonly accepted wavelength, which is not the wavelength of peace and love. It's the wavelength of doubt. That's what the traumatized self jives with, the plane it lives on. The schizophrenic homeless person is someone who had an individual break of self. The project of selfhood ended in calamity for this person too, and no one caught them. That's it. They didn't do anything to deserve their lot in life in the same way that I didn't mine. It just happened. And so again, this may be an area where we feel called to politics, and I think any authentic political orientation will be concerned with distributing and suffusing selves and other entities with love. It is a recognition that love is a limitless resource. It's perhaps the only limitless resource. And once we feel that, not only can we give it, but we feel called to give it as widely as possible. Something else I feel called to say here is that although we may want to save people through this proliferation of love, we won't be able to save everyone. And that's okay too. That's something that the individual self has to accept. It's an expectation the individual self must unburden itself of. And it's easier once one realizes the truth I spoke about at the beginning. Peace and love are the fundamental and resounding condition and vibration of the universe. This being the case, even as individual selves toil in unimaginable hardship, as many do, the peace and love remain. It is not a necessary condition of it that it be experienced. A different way of putting this, and this is perhaps more familiar to someone who was raised with a traditional religious orientation, is God is always there. God is always watching, regardless of whether you remember or are aware of God. So, the schizophrenic homeless person may not be brought back to peace. The person who attempts suicide may succeed. In either case, the base structure of the universe that is an undifferentiated, loving, self-experiencing entity or consciousness does not change. So our politics may compel us to share love, but simultaneously we know that our doing so is not necessary. It's a strange paradox. It's sort of like this: the universe is perfect and we want to make it more perfect. That's how I've begun to think of it. If it makes you smile, I think it's a thought worth living by. So, what I'm really speaking of now is salvation. Salvation for the individual self. Where does it come from? And this is either my fourth or third teaching, I can't remember. Initially, it generally comes from human help. The self begins to receive love from selves outside it. It breaks, the project of selfhood is exposed as doomed, and the self appeals for resources to other human selves. I had a very healing relationship with a therapist. From that point, my friendships became healthier, my romantic relationships became more reliable. I began to resolve karma in my relationships with my parents, and there was just this expanding sense of the universality of love. Through this expansion, eventually domains beyond the human realm become open as well. The self realizes the narrowness of its traumatized and conditioned individuality and looks to greener pastures, literally and figuratively. So, nature takes on a vibrating value for us. We begin to feel a presence, even when in the proximity of beings who cannot speak in human language. That's one stage. Another stage is recovery of the sacredness or the oneness of inanimate objects. So, for me, I no longer need to go for a walk in nature to experience the sacred or experience oneness or peace or love. It's pleasurable. I like to do it. But I know that it's not necessary. I can experience those things in my room, in the room I'm in now, with these walls and this camera that to my human eye is dead, is inert, it's a machine. But the undifferentiated state, the oneness, the love, the peace, they are still undeniable. There's even a further initiation, a further stage, which is thought of as ego death. I suppose this is really the individual self's conclusion. This is the coup de grace. There's nowhere to go from here. And the way I think of this is the self becomes sufficiently suffused with love through its openness. It realizes that on its own it doesn't know how to live. It opens to love from external sources. First human, then beyond human, even inanimate, so on and so forth. Perhaps spiritual texts come into the mix, meditation. Love pours into the self, and a point is reached where the reality of love and peace overshadow the reality of the self. This is the moment of ego death. It's a moment where the undifferentiated, irreducible, unchangeable state of the universe becomes more prominent in my consciousness than my own story of self, the story of Jackson and all of the things he must fix and change in order to earn love. Sort of a point where an axis is tipped, or a seesaw tips, and there's no going back from it. It happened for me at a Buddhist retreat this past summer. I was doing meditation, and I had this experience where, I was bowing to a statue of the Buddha. I'm about to put this in human language, but it was an experience outside of language. I realized that millions of people throughout history had done these same bows and made these same chants, and would continue to do so, and were doing so elsewhere in the world at that same moment. And this grand procession was exposed to me of people worshiping this fundamental value of peace throughout all time and throughout all space. And I realized that even the perception of this being a linear procession, that too was illusory. What became evident was simply the value itself, the resounding peace and love that in that moment the individual self, Jackson, was worshiping. Of course, I came back to myself afterward. I said, whoa, I just had an experience of ego death. I told our group leader that in no uncertain terms. I came back to my individual experience of self, but what has remained constant from that moment is this knowledge of the undifferentiated, irreducible, ineradicable condition of peace and love that bound our every experience. This awareness has consequences in our lives, even though we know that we no longer need to change our lives, that we no longer need to change anything about ourselves. So, paradoxically, knowing that I no longer need to change my emotions or change my thoughts allows them to change much more quickly, facilitates that change. The painful feelings I had last night were experienced by me as feelings that I had to experience. And perhaps I did fight them, and have been fighting them. But in back of mind, there's always this awareness that no matter what I, as the superficial individual self, experience, that reality of love and peace is always there. God is always there. And I hope the way in which I'm using this word God is palatable to you. Whether you're committed to a religion or not, or you're even a skeptic, what I'm really speaking of is the oneness that persists beneath the traumatized individual consciousness. So, thoughts and feelings begin to dissipate and change more rapidly However, it's no longer as a consequence of our intending to do this. Something I notice about a lot of spiritual discourse is that it's still concerned with changing thoughts and feelings and the state of consciousness. And I think this is because it hails from a consciousness that, to some degree, is still traumatized, is still attempting to improve itself. Could also be that it needs to find a place in an economy where things are sold. And things are generally sold by convincing the consumer that they have some lack. Most of our systems are this way. I'm in the system of education right now, and grading communicates a lack, communicates that there's something wrong with the self. So do course sequences. I must learn this in order to gain the knowledge that I will then need to take that course, and I must gain these degrees in order to access later fields, and so on and so forth. Through time, the trauma and the belief of the incomplete self are being reinstated, re-encoded. So much spiritual discourse, too, buys into this principle. And it says, here are the teachings that I have, and they will fix your consciousness. They will make you more peaceful more of the time. I think I mentioned Eckhart Tolle earlier. He speaks of coming into the present moment, coming into the now, and how it will release the pain body. And so only bliss will be left. Something I am coming to know is, maybe, I still have my tormented experiences. I still have even my individual project of self. And I think I always will. For me, the knowledge that I have about the nature of the universe and the absolute truth of its glaring love and peace, this does not necessitate that I change myself in order to more greatly approximate that condition. A different way of saying this is that I know that individual experiences on some level do not matter. There's nothing wrong I can do in my life. My life exists within a container of absolute peace and love. Nothing that I do is going to change that, no matter how widely my consciousness may differ from that, no matter how maximally I or any other being may suffer. The peace and the love are still there, and they are blaring, they are resounding at all times. This is tremendously relieving, to know that we don't have to do anything or achieve anything. Something I think about sometimes is, what is the purpose of existence? The individual self really wants to know this. It also wants to be able to answer questions such as, is there free will? Because if there's free will, then the individual self can take responsibility for its achievements. And sometimes it wants there not to be free will, so that it can dismiss the bad things that have happened. Oh, those just happened. You know, it wasn't me who deserved that, earned it. But these are the kinds of things the individual self is concerned with. It wants more data so that it can more greatly improve itself to restore the peace and love that it feels it is owed, to right that wrong of the traumatized self. Speaking from the greater awareness that I've been tapping into in this transmission, the awareness synchronized with the peace and love of the universe. The purpose of existence is for the individual self to experience itself. Put differently, it's for the one soul that exists in all beings to experience itself through relationships and interactions among those beings, and through experiences that individual beings have. The purpose of existence is for the one soul to experience itself as myriad selves. This being the case, the trauma that we experienced that created our individual selves is necessary to the purpose of existence. In fact, it's part of the purpose of existence. The individual self is created so that through time, the one soul, the one consciousness, can observe itself having experiences and changing and growing. And so just as we may believe in the reincarnation of the soul among multiple bodies, throughout the individual life, the individual self is reincarnated many times as new traumas are accrued, and then the self experiences breaking points, has crises. All this is purposeful, is by design. The one soul that there is wants to watch the individual self change and grow and break itself apart and come to crisis and then receive love and be transformed and transfigured by love. I wanted to share these teachings because they make me feel better in my life, even as my material experience changes so much. And as I go through the fear and the newly incurred traumas of the individual self, to know that these are by design and that their purpose is to help consciousness experience itself is a steadying thing for me. And I think it's part of my purpose to communicate it to other beings. So, it's still very bright outside, and now I'm feeling tired. And I'm looking at the camera, and I did this for almost an hour. I want to thank you very much for listening to this, and I hope that it found you well, and I hope you were able to gain something from it, regardless of whether you agree or disagree. And I hope you have a lovely day and a wonderful life. Thank you.